The sound of the gavel cracked through the chamber like a thunderclap. Judge Beryl Howell's voice followed, sharp and cutting, slicing through the murmurs in the room. With every word she pressed down harder, her tone dripping with authority, her posture radiating control. To those watching, it felt less like a courtroom and more like a stage where Howell relished the role of punisher. Her eyes locked on Jasmine Crockett, and the intent was unmistakable. Humiliation. Crockett sat there, framed by the heavy silence of the room, every eye on her. The judge's rebuke rolled over her like a storm, meant to drown out resistance. Howell wielded her power like a weapon, each phrase intended to remind everyone that she commanded the gavel, the chamber, the rules. Crockett was painted as the offender, the one who had dared to step out of line, the one Howell would make an example of. The tension was unbearable. Spectators leaned forward, unsure if Crockett could withstand the weight of the moment. It was a scene designed to crush an authority figure standing tall, a lone representative appearing trapped beneath the weight of judgment. You could almost feel the imbalance, as if Crockett's voice had been swallowed whole by the booming authority of the bench. For a moment it seemed Howell had succeeded. The rebuke echoed in the air, sharp as glass. Crockett's silence felt heavy, almost dangerous. To the untrained eye she looked cornered, subdued, forced into submission by the sheer force of arrogance wielded against her. But silence is never as empty as it seems. Behind Crockett's measured stillness, there was calculation. Behind her eyes there was memory, preparation, and an understanding forged from years of standing against powers greater than herself. Howell saw only a target to reprimand. The audience saw only a woman seemingly outmatched. But beneath the surface, something else was building. And as Howell sat back with the smug certainty of someone who believed she had already won, the truth remained invisible to her. But what Howell didn't know was that Crockett had spent her entire life preparing for this very moment. The room held its breath after the sting of Howell's rebuke. The sound of the gavel still seemed to hang in the air, echoing like a threat that refused to fade. It was more than a procedural reprimand. It was theater. Howell, cloaked in her robes of authority, wasn't simply applying rules, she was making a statement. She wanted everyone to see who controlled the room, who defined the boundaries, who would not hesitate to put a younger, outspoken Congresswoman in her place. And that is what made this clash matter. Because it was never just about rule. It was about the struggle between rigid authority and living truth, between the old guard's iron grip on order and the rising voices of those who demanded dignity. Howell embodied a world that believed power flowed from the gavel, the robe, the institution itself. Crockett represented the opposite, power drawn from the people, from lived experience, from the conviction that even the loudest gavel cannot silence truth spoken with courage. The chamber around them transformed into something larger than itself. It wasn't just wood panels, marble floors and stiff benches. It felt like an arena. The silence wasn't passive. It was charged, suspenseful, vibrating with the awareness that this moment was different. The spectators knew it, even if they couldn't name it. The reporters scribbling notes, the aides shifting in their seats, the eyes darting from judge to representative. They all sensed that beneath the surface of formality, something volatile was about to break free, and there was reason to fear. Howell carried the full weight of institutional power. She had the authority to cut Crockett off, to silence her, to reduce her words to nothing more than objections overruled. She had precedent, procedure, and intimidation on her side. Crockett, by contrast, had nothing in her hands but her voice. No robe, no gavel, no shield of status, just words, and the ability to wield them with precision. For most, that would not be enough. Against someone like Howell, words often fell flat, crushed beneath the certainty of rulings and the arrogance of unchecked authority. But Crockett was not moved. In that silence, in that heavy stillness where Howell believed she had already secured the upper hand, Crockett began to gather herself. She did not rush. She did not break. She let the moment breathe, let the power imbalance expose itself so fully that when she finally moved, every word would carry the weight of inevitability. The audience could sense it, though faintly, a shift in the air, the kind of shift that comes before a storm, subtle at first, undeniable once it begins to roll. Howell thought she was demonstrating dominance, but in her eagerness to punish, she had overlooked the quiet strength building before her, and that was the fatal miscalculation. Because in trying to make an example out of Jasmine Crockett, Judge Howell wasn't tightening her grip, she was setting the stage for her own undoing. And when Howell tried to make an example out of Crockett, she unknowingly triggered a showdown that would stun the entire room. For years, Judge Beryl Howell had been a name that carried weight in Washington. In legal circles, her reputation was etched in stone: strict, uncompromising, a figure who valued authority above all else. To walk into her courtroom was to step into a world where she alone dictated the rules of engagement. Attorneys whispered about her sharp tongue and cutting rebukes, about how quickly she could turn proceedings into a public lesson on hierarchy and control. She was the kind of judge who didn't just interpret the law, she embodied it, or at least believed she did. Her rulings were often remembered less for their nuance, and more for the way they stamped her dominance on a case. Colleagues described her as authoritative. Critics called her authoritarian. Where others sought balance, Howell thrived on certainty. It wasn't enough to deliver a judgment. She had to make sure the losing side felt the sting. Lawyers who appeared in her court rarely forgot the experience, not because of the justice dispensed, but because of the fear it inspired. She believed fear ensured order, and order in her mind was the highest good. Over time, this approach hardened into arrogance. The longer she sat on the bench, the more convinced she became that her interpretation of the law was not just one perspective, but the only one that mattered. She carried herself with the posture of someone untouchable, insulated by the robe, the gavel, and the deference automatically granted to her position. When she spoke, people listened, not because they respected her, but because they knew defiance meant punishment. She cultivated silence in her courtrooms, a silence born not of awe but of intimidation. There were countless examples that fed this image. Attorneys recalled how she would interrupt mid-sentence, dismantling arguments before they could fully form. Witnesses felt her glare press down on them like a physical weight. Some of her harshest rulings were less about the facts of a case, and more about the statement they made, a reminder that she was the arbiter, and anyone who challenged that authority would walk away bruised, even if only in reputation. To many, she seemed less a servant of justice, and more a warden of control. What made Howell particularly dangerous was that she believed this was strength. In her mind, the absence of challenge meant validation. The fear she inspired, she mistook for respect. The silence she demanded, she misread as order. And in a city like Washington, where appearances and power plays defined so much, Howell had carved out a niche as someone who could not be rattled, someone untouchable. But beneath that polished image was hypocrisy. She often spoke of fairness while bending rules to enforce her own dominance. She talked about respect for the law, yet her actions revealed a deeper respect for her own ego. Those who watched closely could see the cracks: moments where she dismissed legitimate concerns, moments where her impatience betrayed bias. She was not a woman of balance, but of imbalance carefully disguised as firmness. And the more she leaned on intimidation, the more she revealed how fragile her authority truly was. Still, for years no one dared to confront it. Howell's courtroom was a place where resistance rarely survived. Lawyers whispered in hallways, journalists hinted in op-eds, but in her presence, even the boldest voices learned to quiet themselves. She had perfected the art of silencing until Jasmine Crockett walked into her path. Because what Howell never accounted for was someone who could not be cowed by fear. Someone who understood the law not as a tool for control but as a weapon of truth. Someone who had fought her entire life against being underestimated. Who had risen not by demanding silence but by breaking. Howell was used to winning by intimidation. But intimidation only works on those willing to shrink in its shadow. And Jasmine Crockett was not one of them. But in Jasmine Crockett, Howell had met her match. Jasmine Crockett's journey did not begin in the polished halls of Washington, or in the glow of cameras and microphones. It began in places where the law wasn't an abstract principle, but a daily force shaping lives, sometimes cruelly, sometimes with indifference. She grew up watching people she loved navigate systems that seemed designed to work against them, and it left an imprint that would never fade. Where others saw the law as distant, Crockett saw it as something painfully close, something that could crush or liberate, depending on who held the power. That awareness fueled her from the very beginning. Crockett didn't come from privilege. She came from persistence. She understood sacrifice in ways many of her colleagues could barely imagine. While others were born into legacies of influence, she had to build her own path, brick by brick, every step a fight against doubt, doubt from others, and sometimes even from herself. Yet the further she walked into that struggle, the more she discovered her own resolve. When she chose law, it wasn't out of fascination with legal theory. It was survival. She saw too many communities where voices went unheard, where justice bent to the wealthy or powerful, where the gavel fell hardest on those least able to defend themselves. She wanted to change. She wanted to turn the very system that had been used to silence her people into a shield. She threw herself into her studies with the hunger of someone who knew failure wasn't an option. Late nights with books, early mornings chasing clerkships, hours in the library when others were asleep. This was her crucible, and she excelled, not because the path was smooth, but because every obstacle became proof of her resilience. Professors who doubted her were forced to acknowledge her brilliance. Colleagues who underestimated her learned the cost of dismissing her intellect. She developed not just knowledge of the law but the ability to wield it with precision, to dissect arguments until the flaws lay bare, to turn complexity into clarity. What Howell wielded as a weapon of intimidation, Crockett mastered as an instrument of liberation. Her early career was a testament to this. Crockett didn't choose the easy cases or the safe clients. She represented those with the odds stacked against them. The single mother fighting eviction, the young man facing charges inflated beyond reason, the immigrant family bewildered by a system written in a language they didn't yet speak. For every case she lost, she gained sharper skill. For every case she won, she gave voice to someone who had almost given up hope. These experiences carved her into more than a lawyer. They shaped her into a fighter who understood what was truly at stake. The law wasn't lines of text in dusty books. It was a lifeline. It was the thin barrier between despair and dignity. She carried those lessons with her when she entered politics, determined to bring that same tenacity into public service. But even then, people underestimated her. They saw a woman of color, outspoken and direct, and thought they could dismiss her as another voice easily drowned out in the noise of Washington. And yet, every time they underestimated her, she thrived. In debates, she was sharper. In hearings, she was relentless. In community spaces, she was present in ways her rivals never were. She had lived the struggle she now legislated on, and that authenticity resonated. When she spoke, people knew she wasn't repeating talking points. She was channeling experience, memory, and a promise to fight for those who had been told their struggles didn't matter. That was the essence of Jasmine Crockett, underestimated again and again, only to rise stronger each time. Her roots, her sacrifices, her years as a lawyer, all of it prepared her not just to survive in Washington, but to stand firm when others tried to push her down. So when Judge Beryl Howell thought she could shame Jasmine Crockett with a lecture on law, when she believed her gavel and robe were enough to corner her, she had no idea of the lifetime of preparation sitting quietly across from her. So when Howell thought she could shame Crockett with legalese, Crockett responded with brilliance. Howell never saw coming. Judge Howell leaned forward, her voice rising, her words sharp and deliberate. Each interruption came faster than the last, cutting into Crockett's sentences before they had a chance to unfold. It was less about substance than domination, an exercise in control designed to show the room who was in charge. The gavel struck again, louder this time, as if the sound alone could overpower Crockett's presence. Howell's warnings grew heavier, layered with the threat of procedural punishment, the kind of penalties meant to silence rather than correct. The room tightened with tension. Spectators shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two women. Some scribbled furiously in notebooks. Others sat frozen, waiting to see how far Howell would push. The atmosphere was no longer neutral, it was suffocating. Every person in the chamber could feel the imbalance, the sense that one voice was being systematically smothered. Howell carried herself with the certainty of someone convinced that the weight of the institution would always tilt in her favor. And yet, there was something strange about the way Crockett responded. She didn't flinch at the gavel. She didn't rush to speak over the interruptions. She didn't raise her voice to meet Howell's. Instead, she remained calm, steady, composed. Her silence was not surrender. It was calculation. Every measured glance, every pause, every breath suggested a woman not overwhelmed but waiting. The more Howell pressed, the more it became clear. This wasn't a simple reprimand. It was an attempt to corner Crockett, to force her into a mistake, to provoke her into anger, so that Howell's authority could be justified by Crockett's reaction. But Crockett refused to take the bait. She let Howell's aggression pile higher, let the spectacle build, let the imbalance reveal itself for what it was. The tension that Howell believed was suffocating Crockett was, in fact, suffocating the judge herself. Whispers began to ripple through the room. Observers sensed it too, that the calm on Crockett's face was not weakness but resolve. The contrast between the two women was stark. Howell loud, brittle, visibly straining to hold control. Crockett silent, collected, like a storm gathering strength just beyond the horizon. Howell's voice grew shriller, the gavel striking harder. each interruption a desperate attempt to tighten her grip. But the harder she pressed, the more the chamber felt the ground shifting. Howell thought she was building a wall around Crockett, trapping her. In truth, she was building a stage, and on that stage, the silence stretched longer, heavier, until it seemed unbearable. Every spectator leaned forward, every pen paused above paper, every camera lens fixed unblinking on Crockett. Then, with the room holding its breath, Crockett finally spoke. The silence cracked, not with a gavel, not with an outburst, but with Jasmine Crockett's voice measured, calm, deliberate. Her words rolled out like steel wrapped in velvet, soft enough to sound composed, sharp enough to cut through the air. "Judge Howell," she began, her tone almost gentle, "I respect the authority of this chamber, but respect does not mean silence, and authority does not mean infallibility." The room stirred. Reporters glanced up from their notes. Staffers froze mid-shift in their chairs. Even the faintest whisper seemed too loud in the heavy quiet that followed. Howell's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing, as if she had not expected Crockett to answer at all. Crockett continued, pacing her words with surgical precision. "You have invoked procedure as though it were a shield, but I was trained in these procedures. I practiced them long before I ever stepped foot in this chamber, and I know the difference between procedure used to protect fairness and procedure weaponized to stifle truth." A ripple went through the audience. It was subtle at first, a low murmur, a shuffled foot, the faint click of a pen halted in motion. Howell shifted in her chair, her hand pressing against the bench, her authority suddenly feeling less like a fortress and more like a fragile mask. Crockett paused, letting the silence breathe. She looked straight at Howell, her gaze unwavering. "The law is not a gavel, it is not a robe, it is not even a bench. The law is a promise that every voice, no matter how small, will be heard. And when that promise is broken, it is not the voice that is out of order, it is the chamber." Gasps rippled through the room. Someone at the back let out a low whistle before catching themselves. A few aides exchanged glances, their lips curling into the beginnings of smiles they dared not show too openly. Howell's composure faltered, her lips parted as if to interject, but no words came. Crockett pressed forward. Her voice did not rise in anger. It deepened in authority. "You may think that cutting me off is discipline, but let me remind you, I am an attorney. I have stood before judges who believed their word was final, and I have learned that even when the gavel falls, the truth keeps speaking. That truth is why I am here. That truth is why you cannot silence me." The chamber was electric now. Crockett's pauses were not gaps but thunderous beats, each one giving space for her words to sink deeper. Every time she stopped, the silence wasn't empty, it was loaded, brimming with the unspoken realization that Howell was no longer in control. Howell's eyes flicked to the spectators, to the press, to her aides, as if searching for some anchor. But every anchor was slipping away, pulled toward Crockett's gravity. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping lower, forcing the room to lean in. "You wanted to make an example out of me, so let us make one. Let us show what happens when authority tries to silence truth, when arrogance mistakes itself for power, when procedure is twisted against the very people it was meant to serve." She straightened again, her words cutting clean. "You do not frighten me, Judge Howell. I have faced worse than a gavel. I have lived through storms that no chamber could ever contain. And I am still here, stronger, louder, unmoved." The silence after those words was deafening. Then came the whispers, sharp, urgent, unavoidable. Reporters scribbled furiously, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Staffers leaned into one another, their eyes wide, and even in the rows of aides who usually masked their emotions behind stoic faces, there were faint, irrepressible smiles. Howell's mask of composure cracked further. Her hand twitched toward the gavel, but she hesitated. To strike it now would look desperate, hollow, impotent. She sat back instead, her face rigid, but her authority slipping like sand through her fingers. Crockett, sensing the shift, did not glow. She did not raise her voice or shout her victory. Instead, she let the weight of dignity do the work. "You see, Judge Howell, power is not proven by how loud you strike the bench. It is proven by how steady you remain when challenged. And today you have shown us all what happens when steadiness is replaced with fear." The words landed like a final blow. There was no need for shouting. Crockett's calm had become its own weapon, and it cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. Howell's authority, so carefully constructed, so ruthlessly guarded, lay exposed, and in that moment, the polarity of the room flipped. Crockett was no longer the one cornered. She was the center, the force, the gravity pulling every eye toward her. Howell was no longer the unshakable authority. She was the figure scrambling to maintain what was already lost. The chamber itself seemed to acknowledge it. The silence carried a new weight, not fear of Howell, but awe for Crockett. A sense that something extraordinary had just unfolded, something that would not stay confined to those four walls. Crockett allowed one final pause. Then, with her voice steady as ever, she concluded, "So if this was meant to be my lesson, let it be written clearly. You cannot silence what is rooted in truth. You cannot dismiss what is built on justice. And you cannot punish a woman who has spent her entire life preparing for this moment." Her words echoed in the air, unchallenged, unbroken. Howell sat frozen, her authority visibly shaken, her gavel useless in her hand. Crockett stood taller than ever, not in posture, but in presence. She had flipped the very tools Howell used for control and revealed them as hollow. In that chamber, before the eyes of the nation, dignity had triumphed over arrogance, and brilliance had silenced intimidation. And as the murmurs swelled into a rising wave, it was clear this was no longer just a confrontation. It was a turning point. What came next would ripple far beyond the room. The moment the chamber doors opened, the story had already outrun the walls. Phones lit up, fingers flew, and within minutes the clash between Judge Beryl Howell and Jasmine Crockett was everywhere. On social media the reaction was immediate and ferocious. Clips of Crockett's calm dismantling of Howell's authority spread like wildfire. The hashtags surged with a force no strategist could have planned. Crockett, the genius, dignity over arrogance, legal lion. One video, replaying Crockett's line about the law being a promise, not a gavel, crossed 1 million views in less than an hour. Another, capturing Howell's visible falter as Crockett stood taller, became a meme overnight. Howell frozen mid-scowl, captioned with lines like, "When you realize your intimidation plan just backfired." For every critic who once dismissed Crockett as just another politician, there were now thousands reframing her as something much more. Commentators on cable news broke from their usual cynicism to marvel at what they had witnessed. One legal analyst, a former prosecutor known for tearing apart grandstanding politicians, admitted live on air, "I didn't think she had it in her." But Crockett didn't just survive Howell, she outlawyered her. That's not performance, that's pedigree. Another pundit, visibly shaken, declared, "We just watched someone transform from a representative into a movement." Even rivals who had mocked Crockett before now tread cautiously. One opponent, asked for comment, gave a stiff smile and muttered, "Well, she certainly knows her way around the law." It was the kind of concession that wasn't meant to flatter, but only reinforced the perception that Howell had underestimated someone far more formidable than she expected. The people, though, were louder than the pundits. Immigrants saw in Crockett's defiance a mirror of their own struggles against systems designed to silence them. Young activists, often skeptical of politicians, flooded timelines with posts declaring Crockett a new kind of leader, one who didn't posture but proved her mettle when it mattered most. Mothers shared clips with captions like, "This is how you teach dignity to our children." Students quoted her lines in group chats as if they were battle anthems. And the press, they couldn't resist. Headlines read like tributes. "Crockett stuns Howell with legal masterclass." The day arrogance fell to dignity. Even the more conservative outlets, desperate not to cede the narrative, resorted to cautious respect. Crockett holds her own against Judge Howell, but the careful phrasing only underscored what everyone already knew. The story wasn't Howell's anymore. It belonged to Crockett. Meanwhile, Howell herself became a symbol of something else entirely: brittle authority. Clips of her face, struggling to maintain composure as Crockett spoke, became shorthand for every official who had ever tried to wield power through fear. Commentators whispered that Howell's reputation as a feared enforcer of order might never recover. In the shadow of Crockett's brilliance, Howell's authority looked less like strength and more like fragility. But Crockett never once boasted. She didn't tweet a victory lap, didn't grandstand in front of cameras. She walked out of that chamber with the same composure she had carried inside, dignity intact, calm, unshaken. And in that restraint, the legend only grew larger. It wasn't just her words, It was her steadiness. She hadn't won by shouting Howell down. She had won by standing so firmly in truth that arrogance had no ground left to stand on. The shockwaves were felt not just online but in living rooms, classrooms, workplaces across the nation. People spoke her name with a new kind of respect, a recognition that she wasn't merely another player in politics. She was a force of law, of intellect, of dignity that couldn't be manufactured or dismissed. And yet even as the nation buzzed with hashtags, clips and commentary, the real weight of that moment was not in its virality. It was something quieter, something deeper, a shift in how people saw power, how they measured strength, how they defined dignity in the face of intimidation. The lesson lingered, unspoken but undeniable. Howell had tried to make Crockett an example, but instead she had made her a symbol that could not be contained within a trending topic, a headline, or even a viral video. Because what mattered most wasn't the hashtags, the memes, or even the millions of views. What mattered most was the truth that moment revealed. And as the dust of applause and outrage settled, one question rose above the rest. What would people do with the lesson Crockett had just given? But what mattered most wasn't the viral moment. It was the lesson it left behind. In the quiet after the storm, something became clear. Jasmine Crockett's victory wasn't measured in likes, retweets, or even headlines. It was measured in the way she stood, unshaken, unwavering, untouched by the storm Howell tried to unleash. Because power, as Crockett reminded everyone, doesn't always belong to the loudest voice in the room or the gavel that bangs against the desk. Real power belongs to truth, to preparation, to courage. Howell had the robe, the authority, the machinery of the institution on her side. Crockett had only her voice, but it was sharpened by years of experience, strengthened by battles most of the country would never see, rooted in a lifetime of knowing exactly what it meant to be underestimated. And in that moment, the world saw something undeniable. Courage outlasts intimidation. Dignity outshines arrogance. This wasn't just about a single courtroom clash. It was about something larger, something symbolic. It was about what happens when women of color, so often dismissed, so often silenced, refused to bow to institutional arrogance. It was about watching history bend toward a truth that could no longer be ignored. Howell tried to corner Crockett, but instead she revealed the strength of a generation that has no interest in shrinking to fit inside the cages of tradition. And it wasn't only women of color who felt the resonance. Anyone who had ever been told to sit down, to be quiet, to know their place. Immigrants, students, workers, dreamers recognized their own story in Crockett's calm defiance. She didn't just argue law, she embodied the lived reality of people whose voices are too often treated as disposable. She reminded the world that preparation is power, that intelligence is resistance, that dignity is not weakness but the purest form of strength. The lesson became impossible to ignore. Arrogance can silence a room, but only for a moment. Dignity carries forward long after the echo of a gavel fades. And Crockett's victory didn't just belong to her. It belonged to every person who has ever been underestimated, belittled, cornered, and told they weren't enough. In her triumph, they saw their own possibility. Her presence, her poise, her precision, all of it fused into something unforgettable. A moral truth that stretched far beyond the walls of that chamber. She didn't just prove herself as a politician, or even as a lawyer. She proved herself as a symbol of resilience, the kind that institutions cannot contain and intimidation cannot crush. And that is where the real victory lived. Not in the moment Howell fell silent, but in the way the silence became a mirror for the nation. In that reflection, people saw the truth. Authority can be rattled, arrogance can stumble, but dignity, when wielded with courage and conviction, can never be defeated. Her victory wasn't just hers. It was for the daughters watching their mothers struggle, for the immigrant families who carried hope through oceans and borders, for the young activists told they're too idealistic, for the workers silenced by managers, for every single person who has ever been underestimated. Crockett's stand was there, and in that stand, they found proof of something greater than power. They found proof of possibility. The gavel had tried to close the moment, but the truth, once spoken, could not be contained. Judge Beryl Howell set out to punish Jasmine Crockett. She wielded her gavel like a weapon, believing the robe and the title were enough to bend Crockett into submission. But instead of breaking her, Howell ignited something far more powerful. What was meant to be a rebuke became a revelation. Howell's attempt backfired, and in front of the nation, she exposed not Crockett's weakness but her own.
Because what we witnessed wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was the collision of two forces: arrogance and intelligence, authority and dignity.